We think there are three things the Kremlin cares about in this debate. First of all, is maintaining political power for the economic and political elite that exists within Russia. Secondly, about to a certain extent keeping the Russian economy afloat and profitable. And finally, we think they do care about developing a security apparatus that will allow them to push back against rising superpowers like China, but also against rising threats of domestic terrorism. Now, note here that sometimes what we care about may overlap with the interests of what is better for the average Russian citizen, and sometimes they won't. So we think this is ultimately about what is best for the Kremlin and the people who hold power within Russian institutions. So there are two things I'm going to do on opening government today. First of all, demonstrate where China and the Kremlin do have orthogonal interests and why those are specifically hurt by a policy that facilitates a close relationship with China. And secondly, we're going to explain to you that why this policy is best to actually support Russian interests both domestically and abroad. So, note here, on the first argument, that given that Russia and China do have often antithetical interests in various corners of the world, ranging from Central Asia to Africa, it is really bad for the Russian economy and for Russian politicians to become even more dependent on China, because that will make it far harder for them to actually actively pursue Russian interests at times at which they conflict with Chinese interests. So, where do these orthogonal interests exist? First of all, I think this exists on the African continent as a whole, given that both China and Russia have been pursuing a lot of economic projects regarding the expansion of railways, but also investment into state-owned African companies within the continent. So we think that from Algeria to Uganda, Russia is continuously building up infrastructure in Africa, lending support to embattled strongmen, taking on natural resource projects in conflict-racked states, and positioning itself as a new power broker in the region without the baggage that former colonial powers bring with it. This looks like trying to double its arms sales within the past 3 years in Africa. Having Rosneft and Lukoil invest in Egypt, Algeria, and Mozambique, trying to massively expand existing oil fields, but also engage on new exploration projects. I'll take clarifications.
They cannot just debate the motion, the world where Russia is not dependent is a better world. They have to show you how the policies they have to defend are going to affect the relations with China and how the more world changes.
You'll note that that's part two of my argument. So, I'm going to talk about why this competes directly against Chinese investments and why that's such a bad thing. Number one, look at the fact that China is also trying to become a new superpower within that region with the expansion of the One Belt, One Road project, with the expansion of railways and new infrastructure into the area, but also by specifically developing relationships with local strongmen and regional strongmen, and trying to outcompete Russia when it comes to, for instance, the sale of arms, but also when it comes to actual foreign investment. So China is investing in a lot of the same sorts of companies that Russia is also trying to get a foothold into for a couple of reasons. Number one, both Russia and China do want access to things like rare earth minerals and aluminium in places like Guinea. Number two, they also compete to sell weapons in countries like Zambia and Angola. So the more stuff that China can sell into that region by developing a better relationship, no thanks, with the kinds of people who hold political power in that region, I think it's a lot harder for Russia to actually be able to outcompete them in that way. But secondly, I want to talk about Central Asia. Note here that Russia is also to a large extent trying to buy influence within Central Asia through things like military cooperation and through things like economic investment, specifically in state-owned natural gas and oil companies. This is the exact same policy that China is also pursuing in places like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, again in direct competition with one another. So why are these two regions so crucial to the Kremlin's interests? Number one, Russia's ability to expand to both Central Asia and Africa is helping keep its economy afloat. Given that there are a lot of sanctions that have been put on it after 2014, since the annexation of Crimea, and also as contingency to the whole stuff in eastern Ukraine, it's a lot harder for them to access traditional markets as they would otherwise. So we think that at the point at which Russia is a country that is struggling to a certain extent to access traditional markets as a result of sanctions, but also other forms of capital that would normally be available to it, it's far better for them to pursue investments in Africa and Central Asia, and for them to be able to do it in a way that is far more competitive when you don't have to worry about China actually pushing back against those kinds of things. But second, I think it's really important when it comes to the security apparatus, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So so why is this specific in the Kremlin's interests? Note that for the Kremlin to actually retain power within Russia, they must provide a decent level of economic and political stability, because this is the implicit promise that the Kremlin has made to the Russian people, right? Putin's popularity within Russia relies on his ability to actually ensure that there is some level of domestic growth and some level of domestic stability. So, secondly, why is this the best policy to pursue to actually support Russia's interests? I'm going to note here, and this is going to be a direct response to the POI we got earlier, about why the specific the specific areas of dependence that Russia currently has on China are so terrible for its economic and security future. Yeah. So number one, Note that Russian dependency on China exists in a couple of ways. It means that at the point at which Russia becomes more dependent on, for instance, the Chinese currency reserves, but also like Chinese companies as well, it means that they're able to do they can actually curb that influence in a couple of ways. It means that number one, you can limit the selling of raw materials to China, because that means that you can sell these raw materials, like natural gas specifically, to other markets, for instance, in Central Asia. This is really good because for a couple of reasons. Number one, it allows you to develop more allies and more partnerships with other countries that you might want to form a strong relationship or a tie to. And secondly, means that China just has less resources to actually fuel its manufacturing engine at the point at which you conduct less trade with it when it comes to primary resources, specifically when it comes to things like natural gas. I'll take another POI from opening.
They assume that the conflict of interest between raw material gain and traditional markets is the same. China needs raw materials, Russia don't, because Siberia. Traditional markets is a place where conflict does not exist.
No. But yes, Russia has some raw materials, like in natural gas and oil specifically, but it doesn't have access to other things like rare earth minerals that you can only mine from some countries in Africa. So at the point at which Russia actually wants to develop a manufacturing base, for instance, when it comes to trying to compete on the cell phone market, means that the only way you can do that is by getting those resources from abroad, which is something that China is also striving to do. So why is it then bad to have such a large share of your currency reserves denominated in Chinese yuan? It means that functionally this ties Russia's financial health to the fate of the Chinese economy, which means that in the future, if you do want to, for instance, more significantly limit trade to China in some way, it is far harder for you to actually pursue those policies at the point at which this can actually hurt your foreign of your markets as well. But secondly, I think it's really bad that Chinese companies are able to develop 5G infrastructure within Russia as well. Number one, this is a massive security risk given the extent to which Chinese companies tend to cooperate with the Chinese state, right? This is probably the most sophisticated security apparatus that exists in the world, and having that become an integral part of your telecommunications functions is really, really bad because it creates a level of massive dependency. Because allowing China to operate your telecommunication services means that they can now use this as leverage at the point at which you actually want to, for instance, take diplomatic steps that they might want to avoid in the future. So we think having this level of cooperation specifically in regards to telecommunications is terrible. But finally, we think Russia must be able to combat Chinese influence in different parts of the world. This includes disrupting trade networks and the ability to, for instance, cultivate loyalists in various parts of the world. This becomes a lot harder at the point at which you become more dependent on Chinese economy and the Chinese technology as a whole. Very proud to propose.
Thank the Prime Minister very much. We're very happy to call upon the Leader of Opposition.
Unless they want to concede a lot of economic harms on proposition, they need to tell you what is the comparative in this world. Where will Russia send its raw materials? Who will develop Russia's economy? They never give you a real analysis how Russia will cope with this. Therefore, they concede a lot of negative economic impacts that go directly against the interests of Kremlin because they undermine the economic position of Russians that the popularity of Kremlin depends on. But to be fair, they give us one alternative. They say if Russia stops trading with China, they will trade more with Central Asia. A disclaimer, they're already doing that. In fact, they have fantastic relationship with Central Asia specifically, right? In the years when relationship between Russia and China was getting stronger with all these pacts, Russia has created Eurasian Economic Union together with Kazakhstan and the other countries around them two lakes. So it goes hand in hand. And moreover, just let's play a game of numbers, right? Count up entire Central Asia, maybe you get to 100 million, maybe not. Count the numbers of China, it's over 1 billion people, nearing 2 billion people. So you cannot offset the harms by losing the market of China to a great degree by selling to 100 million if this is the problem. We say that the more likely alternative is for Russia to look for partners elsewhere, right? Europe, West, wherever. And here, like we say, that it's not very likely that this will happen because the relationship right now are not the best. Right? Mind the sanctions, and secondly, they don't really have complementary economies, right? Russia can sell all these raw materials to China because Chinese factories demand it. No comparative is established on proposition. 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, when they talk about how there are different interests of China and Russia in Africa, therefore Russia should somehow distance themselves from China. clarification, first response is that we don't think that Africa is such a big issue for Russia, right? We don't think that that's their main zone of interest. In fact, on proposition, they probably also disagree when they talk about how Central Asia should be the main focus of Russia. Secondly, and more importantly, we don't see how this is relevant, right? You can still compete with Russia, with China in Africa, even though you have a closely integrated economy, right? You can still have your companies going there, competing with Chinese ones. They never give you the comparative. How is this different, right? Look at France and Germany, closely integrated economies, dependent on each other. They both compete for economic influence in smaller European states. We don't see how it's different. Second point of rebuttal is the one I already dealt with the Central Asia. Sorry about that. Now, lastly, about this massive security risk that development, specifically of 5G network, is posing is for Russia and Kremlin specifically. We say that this is an issue of 5G, right? And whoever will develop this kind of network will have the power. And we say that comparatively, as opposed to other countries that might sometime in the future have that technology, it's way better that the information, all that information that proposition talks about, is in the hands of China, since China has a long-standing history of non-interference in other countries. This is what it makes it different to the West and to the other potential partners that could develop such powers. Okay, now to my constructive, I have 3 points. Firstly, I will talk about the direct economic harms which limiting the dependency would create. Secondly, I will talk about the volatility of a relationship, how China's relationship should be more valid because of that. And thirdly, I talk about the security situation, or maybe Mattia will talk about, we'll see how we go with time. Okay, so firstly about the economic benefits. The first benefit is quite straightforward, and I think I already explained to you. Russia is having a huge economic gain by selling all these raw materials, and on the other hand, Chinese companies are developing infrastructure. This directly benefits the people of Russia, right? It is increasing their living standards because the factories, their mines are able to function, and therefore it is also increasing power for Kremlin, right? Because people are more satisfied with their lives, they're less likely to rebel. But more importantly, the Chinese market has, comparatively with other markets that Russia could focus on, very huge potential for development, right? The middle class in China is just right now growing because China has already reached the stage when it has to a large degree eliminated poverty. And now at the point where the middle class is growing, the demand for products that are more advanced is also growing, right? Because they have fulfilled the demands for textile, food, or whatever, and the Chinese consumers want more and more offensive stuff. And I think that in this issue, Russia can then also develop its economy to fit to that market, because it's highly likely that China won't have this demand fulfilled by themselves, especially in the context of how China is straining its relationship with the West, right? Where they would be able to get these fancy advanced electronics or whatever kind of products. Another issue is the tourism that is now development of tourist sector in Russia has a vast potential, especially since the number of Chinese tourists is growing, and this is a very important mechanism by which Russia can decrease its own dependency on raw materials, right? If they have nice relationship with China, it's more likely the visa regime is going to be nice and all that. And secondly, when it comes to the vast potential, I would say that with infrastructure projects and development projects such as the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the Rust and Belt Initiative, China is proving that it wants to play a bigger role in the global economy and that its power is rising. Because of all those reasons, it would be extremely hard for Russia to decrease its dependency on China. Secondly, when it comes to the volatility of the relationship, when it comes to trading with the West, there is one caveat, right? Everything is fine and okay, you can trade, but you have to respect certain rules, right? You have to, look at what happened with Russia, right? Everything was fine and okay, but at the point when Russia started supporting Russian separatists in Ukraine, in Luhansk, in Donetsk, the relationship got strained, right? Why? Because Western countries, because of some reason, have certain values such as democracy, human rights, and stuff like that, right? They want this Washington consensus enforced on countries. But on the comparative, the Bayesian consensus is that we don't care what you do internally, we don't care about human rights abuses, we are going to trade with you. So for Kremlin, which cares about the preservance of its power, and quite frankly likes to do human rights abuses, it is much better for Russia to be dependent on a country that doesn't care about its human rights record than on other countries that might care for it more. And then thirdly, when it comes to the security situation, we say, that's the third point of constructive, we say that by building a mutual dependency, by building integrated supply chain, the risk of conflict with China is much greater, right? And we say that kind of integrated relationship cannot be built with Europe, where the risk of conflict already exists, because the economies are not complementary. And the risk of conflict does exist, as we have seen territorial disputes in the past, the war of 1969 over Siberian land and stuff like that, right? So it's crucial for Russia to develop within its longest land border close economic ties. This was to reduce the potential of war, because the harm for each country that would enter the war would be much greater. Because of all those reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
Thank the Leader of Opposition. We're very happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Could I deconsent from live streaming, please? Thanks. Thank you.
to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Before I begin, I do consent to being filmed, and if Putin is watching this, I say hi. I have. Proposition cannot say to you that Russia can just pick and choose, like I would in a supermarket, trade partners that they want to conduct trade with. If that motion passes, Russia, for instance, will not be able to trade with Vietnam. Vietnam is under the Chinese sphere of influence, for instance. Large swathes of Africa are under Western influence and trade and do infrastructure projects almost exclusively with Western corporations, with Western capital. Russia is not in a position to be the third agent trading with both, especially when the relationship with the West has already become so antagonizing. So the factuality of what DPM told us is, I think, very questionable. I shall go on whipping Rock's material, extending it, and thus answering to the response that we've got. However, already I have to notice to the volatility of relationship about the Beijing consensus. No response at all. Government bench concedes the argument. Let us start with the economic game. First of all, they never come back and explain to us how trading with Mozambique or Kazakhstan is somehow going to replace trading with A, the largest economic power probably in the next 10 years, and B, the largest population country in the world. Like, no explanation here, and the Rock explains to quite nicely that is a problem. Don't barrack me, I'm going to take a closing. Second of all, they say, oh yeah, well, the trade is now going to be better because China is going to be so much weaker because we're going to stop exporting to them and things like that. First contradiction, this is not the diversification. If we're going to stop exporting raw materials, this is not diversification. This is saying fuck you, China. Secondly, when they are answering our point about mutual dependency, they assert that we are dependent on China and China is not dependent on us. Once again, we are confused by their stances. However, the point here is that in Africa right now, competition between Russian and Chinese companies takes place. We are not sure if the Russian companies are going to have such a stronger hand on their side of the house. However, to extend material with my LO, let me tell you this. Siberia is of crucial importance to Russia. Siberia holds pretty much all minerals and raw materials you would ever want. The problem Siberia has is it's lagging behind in economic development. Specifically, Siberia trades almost exclusively with China and smaller Central Asian countries that are almost negligible in this example. So if Russia ever wants to go to be more self-sufficient, as government would have you believe, the thing is that being dependent on China and trading with China as much as possible is crucial, because otherwise Siberia, which is where Russia gains most of its raw resources, is not gonna get developed. Otherwise, no response to the analysis by DPM.
Information.
No, thank you. Second of all, when it comes to the mutual dependency, the thing is that they're not clear on whether or not China is going to be weaker or stronger on their side of the house. But the thing is that as long as they are asserting that they're going to weaken China by this motion, we can tell you that to a large extent, China is also dependent on us, right? Two layers here. First of all, they themselves tell you that they need raw materials. And second of all, Rock explains to you how they need luxury resources for their second class. Like, I'm pretty sure Chinese would appreciate some Russian vodka here. The point of this then is that when you have mutual dependency where both countries profit greatly from trading with one another, the chances of conflict are lesser, because economically, like in terms of mathematics, it makes lesser sense for the Chinese to play dirty against Russia. Because if Russia for China represents at least a substantial, perhaps not majority, but at least a substantial part of their economy, it makes less sense for them to be aggressive towards Russia, which is especially important when you know that Russian and Chinan people actually fought in a war like 50 years ago for Siberian lands in 1969. No other answer to this argument then stands, and this is also how we defeat their point about dependency. stability, because they cannot on the one hand prove that that China is independent and nothing and is gonna screw us over, but on the same hand we're gonna weaken Chinese companies so much that we're gonna like be able to take over the whole of Africa. Oh, I forgot earlier. Can we like go back? The thing about Africa is also that because there is like this bipolar, you know, development of how like you have the West and the Chinese bloc competing, Russia can latch on to the Chinese bloc and is actually cooperating currently as we speak with Chinese companies to, you know, counter the competition from the Western counterparts in the Western capital, which is exactly how, once again, in terms of economic development, this is really good for China, for Russia. No, thank you. I'm gonna take you later on. Like, still got 1 minute. Damn. Let's go to the volatility of the relationship, right? First of all, Beijing consensus means that Xi Jinping doesn't give a flying fuck about what Russia does to the people. Kremlin is homophobic, racist. Like Kremlin is like, people in Kremlin are not really like progressive snowflake debaters, right? What that is that when you try to run such policies in the world, where after 70 years of antagonism of Russia, antagonism of authoritarianism, and this like neoliberal ideology of Western Europe and the Western world, the thing is that you're gonna have problems trading with Europe, which is your #1 economic alternative, because Europe is gonna be like, hey, perhaps try imprisoning gay people less, to which you're like, no. And the problem, actually, yeah, on that, let's hear something on that.
Can I just ask, is the West more scared of China, or is it more scared of Russia?
I don't know why this is relevant. My point in the end here is that for Russia, it does not make sense to trade with Europe as much as they would like to have you believe, because Europe has a much more stronger ideological point of extorting Russia into changing its policies. And that is also the point with the 5G, right? If we have to have someone reading our messages, right, we would much rather prefer it to be the Chinese, because the Chinese don't give a fuck about what's happening. So the thing is that if we want to preserve our racist, homophobic domestic policy, the thing that we want to do is we want to have the Chinese trading with us. And this leads me to the final, you know, edgy extension, where I tell you that even if you buy into them wanting to trade with Europe, I tell you, look, if you say fuck you to China, I like to have you believe, right? The thing is that European Union is going to have a much stronger hand, because you're going to be more forced to accept whatever conditions they give you. So even if we take them on their best case, if you have a strong relationship with China, the point is that you have a stronger negotiation position with European Union, because they have less of a position to extort you. So in the end, what can I tell you? Economic gains, very important, there, no good response. We want to have someone who does not care about us being bad people. Third of all, we want someone who is also dependent on us, not only like a one-way relationship. And finally, we want, you know, to be a bit stronger and flashier in front of the European Union. This is why we are proud to be an opening opposition. Thank you.
Deputy Leader of Opposition, we're very happy to call upon the government member.
Burlington, Berkeley.
Sorry, I have a lot of pages. This is a very small desk. Can I go? Throughout history, Russia has oscillated between whichever ally could give it the best deal, and we say that is now. Opening clash is entirely dependent on economic success. OG say they'll be rich when they trade with Mozambique. OO say they'll be poor. How do you know? What we're going to do in this speech is break that clash and beat opening. Let's firstly just talk about what OO give us. I don't think it's all that much, because basically they just say Russia is screwed if they get rid of their economic ties, and a few other things that I reckon I'll deal with pretty quickly by just repeating them in different words that make clear how silly they are. So they say basically that Russia is screwed if like they go to the other countries who won't have trade anymore. So all I'm going to say is that if we prove that they will trade with the West, and that is it will be the EU and Europe and the US, that is
a much better option for them to do so, that there are actually better economic advantages for them there, and that they will succeed better doing that. If we prove that they are generally more likely to have economic success and therefore more power, we're also going to prove that you get all of the political influence that OG want, because you no longer have to compete with China on those areas, far more likely to have those. I think we'll beat them on that too. Yeah, let's go straight into it. Why is it then that we think we can get the West why do we think that it is possible to get the West to cooperate? One, they say, and the only response they give to the suggestion of to be fair, I think we flag our extension pretty clearly. The only response that we get is, but they won't do it because they're ideologically aligned. I literally just need to say that the US and Saudi Arabia, I just think there are many examples where the West goes against what is ideologically aligned with them because it is economically useful to them. I say that Russia has many things that the EU and generally countries in Europe and US want. I posit oil, I posit raw materials, given the EU has to spend millions on subsidies to provide the very things that Russia can do. I say there's a very strong incentive to cooperate with Russia, and I think the only reason why they haven't is because of alliances with China and because of their stances that they've taken kind of in expansionism. No, I think secondly, I think why this is possible is that they're looking for someone to challenge China's influence. Let's have a look at why exactly the US will accept and will ally with Russia. Look. The US is deeply scared of Chinese strength. And look, OO weren't even willing to admit it in their POI because they literally went, oh, I don't know, because they didn't want to have to admit that they're far more scared of China than they are of Russia. And the reason for this is China is a huge economic powerhouse that now has international strength all around the world, and they're able to do this. But US has no other alternatives for allies. Why is this? One, they can't just take them on their own because they're just too far away from China, too separate. They operate in very different ideological perspectives, different political approaches, and different economies. Two, there are no historical ties with any Central Asian states from whom they could try to form an alliance and cooperate with. Three, there's often antagonism between other countries who would be meaningful allies against them. But four, I actually think the historic relationship between Russia and China makes it an incredible propaganda victory to go inside with someone who used to be their ally. I think this would be incredibly strong, a strong positioning move for the US to take. Now, they might say that it's not domestically palatable to side with Russia. Why is it I actually don't think this is true? I think, one, lots of foreign policy actually isn't palatable, and they do it anyway for the long-term good. But I think, secondly, actually it's becoming increasingly more palatable, the point at which Chinese trade war is destroying like Midwestern states all through the US as these areas become derelict. I think that means that actually it's becoming incredibly palatable to side with a Russia that's able to beat them. I'll take you at the end, I promise. Yep. Right, so why is it then that we think this is good if they're able to? So yeah, and I think the third reason why it's possible, not just that the US will want to do it, but I think that the general historic oscillation of Russian alliances mean that we can understand that it's just possible that they're going to shift around alliances. I don't think it's true that they're stuck in one thing forever. I mean, look at world wars, they always went well for Russia. Cool. So I think we beat only Op-Team by proving that we get economic benefits, and we prove all of those things. So why is it then that it's good for the economy? Loads of things. One, more compatible markets. They're safer companies that they're operating with, which means you don't have to worry about your data being tapped. Because opening up set up a false comparative of, would you rather have China or the US tapping your messages? That's not the comparative. It's would you rather have China tapping your messages or no one tapping your messages? I think it's far safer. It's far safer to operate with US companies and European companies than it is anyone else. Also because you know that they're not going to be trying to working in the backs of the Chinese pockets. I think secondly, you're just closer to them economically, which means trade is far easier because your economic hub of Moscow is far closer to Krakow than it is Beijing. I think that means it's just far more easy to trade with them. But thirdly, I think it also means you have access to EU influence. This is huge because it's also a very standard and uncontroversial influence that allows them to do this. But four, they just assert that I said I'd take you later. But they also said that but the EU doesn't need raw materials. I think this is absolute bull, because we know that the EU has to spend millions on subsidies to provide that very thing. But secondly, not only are the markets compatible, but they're also just more stable. One, China is far more aggressive. They're far more likely to do things like whip away the purchasing of your raw materials if they can find someone cheaper, just to undermine your economy, which means you're building an economy on based on someone that might stab you in the back in the end. But secondly, China's debt situation is screwed, which means at the last minute they might decide to stop funding you because they decide that they can't afford it, and they're still likely to remain that relationship with you rather than all the other countries that are totally economically dependent on you, because they're far more likely to stab you in the back than anyone else. But thirdly, Thirdly, they don't have a history, but thirdly, I think they're much more likely to do horrible things to you, given that Russia does have a history of doing horrible things to other countries. They're far more likely to be skeptical and do worse things. Very quickly closing.
If the United States can crush Russia, will it choose to do so?
No, because the US has no ability to do any of this intervention-y thing anymore, and I don't think they'd choose to, given nuclear power exists. I think that's a ridiculous extension if that's going to be yours. So why is it then that our comparative is better than openings? Because one, it's not dependent on risky developing countries. Because it might be true that they can access Mozambique, but I think it's risky. But I also think that we prove their stuff better. Why is this? And listen to this carefully. Because under the status quo, if they want access to any of the countries that they want access to, they have to go through China first, because China is also competing in these areas. So if they want access to Mozambique, my God, are they going to have to compete with China for it? However, when they have Western backing, it's far less likely that China is going to try and compete with these areas against you, which means that actually we're far more likely to get their path to victory, because we're far more likely to be able to gain access to the countries that they want to and be able to get that trade from them. I think this means not only do we give Russia access to the entirety of the EU and Western markets, but we also exponentially increase their likelihood of gaining access to the entirety of Central Asia, on which OG is contingent on. I think that means we beat them. Look, at the end of this speech, I think we've proven enough that Russia is far better off. They're able to do for everything they want to. Incredibly proud to stand in CG.
You think the government member? We're very happy to call upon the member of opposition.
Want some water? That's okay. Cool. When Nixon engaged in ping-pong diplomacy to recognize the People's Republic of China, what people didn't realize was that was the end of a Sino-Russian relationship and the start of border skirmishes post the mid-1900s. What we will tell you in extension is that the lack of dependency between Russia and China doesn't just mean that Russia loses out on economic interests elsewhere, but it means that China will actively retaliate in a way in which that's bad for Russia. And it is the framing, I think, that's important and deals with the framing opening government talks about. Because, sure, reduction dependency means some things can be done with China, but the point here is they cannot say it's net neutral. The response from China is going to be likely bad, and that's why we will take this debate. The other thing we want to talk about is also that as a result of this, they have assumed the alternatives for Russia exist, but that what they have assumed beyond that is that Russia is capable of seizing those alternatives, i.e. the mines in Africa or the other areas in which China has already have a strong control over. Hence, that's how we take this. But before that, a few responses. And let's look at the alternatives, because I think the strongest case we have in opening government is the competing interests in, say, in other areas means that necessarily we need to, release ourselves from China. I think OO has done some arguments in to say that, well, China is, there are no other alternatives in the West, etc. But we'll add two more responses. The first response is, even if you have alternatives, it's not going to be nowhere near as big as China. China is the largest export market for Russia, in a sense, and that means Chinese companies buy lots of Russian goods and oil. And that in itself means that even if you go down to, say, other countries, you're never going to get the same sort of level of market. But the second reason is China is a point of entry into many major markets, and trade routes. They avoid the Arctic Ocean in delivering their oil and can transport goods via Guangdong instead, and that reduces costs tremendously. And that can only exist because they can go through China. The second reason is Lukoil oil contracts in Spratly Islands, etc. Russian companies has benefited a lot from that due to a quid pro quo with China. What happens instead in their world? So their argument is that currently Russia competes with China for mines and etc. in countries like Africa, in areas in Africa, etc., etc. What we will argue then, therefore, is that Chinese companies, to a large extent, will still want those mines. That's important, right? And therefore, if you're competing, which would many African countries choose? China has built an HQ in Addis Ababa for free for the African Union, and has most times constructed ports in Mombasa in the interest of the African Union to support the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It is in the African Union's interest to always side with Chinese, in most cases when it comes to mine contracts for the extraction of rare earth minerals, etc. Which means, even if you release dependency from China, you're unlikely to gain those mines anyway, So even if there are competing interests, the best way in which you do that is if you find the best ties with China. That is why right now it works out for Russia, because there's a quid pro quo deal where some ports and some mines are exclusively given to Chinese contractors, and some other areas in Africa are given to, say, Russian contractors. And that's great and the best deal Russia can get. But what did then CG talk about? I think their argument is premised on the fact, so the argument is that the US has no allies, the US has no alternatives at the moment and would choose to side with Russia. That's a big problem. The first problem is it does have allies in Asia. Like Tokyo and Seoul would be the cities in which they focus their allies on, especially when those are where their bases are at. But secondly, it's not necessarily in the interest of the US, right? You're talking about the US and the West, who have sanctioned Russia due to things like the poisoning of Sergei Skripal's daughter, and the fact that to a large extent there's been huge interference in US elections. It is political suicide for Trump to do that at this point, and even if it's not because Trump is somehow buddy-buddy with Putin, that he's likely to be unelected, and that volatility, that change in government means that they're likely to lose out. But what's the comparative? I think the dominant strategy from the US isn't to necessarily choose Russia as an ally, but instead take advantage of the fact that Russia now loses China as an ally, and like crush Russia with its sanctions and level up attacks. Why is that in the interest of the US? One, Russia just recently withdrew from violated the INF treaty that reduces, that was really important with regards to nuclear warheads of intermediate range. And there's Western influence at the moment that they want to reject. So at this point, it is very strategic for the US, from a game theory perspective, to necessarily impose more sanctions to Russia, because then you remove one great power in this equation. Similarly, the EU is no longer dependent on Russia for energy, is already energy independent, so it's unlikely to side with Russia and side with the US on that sense. Now, why do we get Chinese retaliation? I think the important bit here is a bit of framing. OO says that there's mutual dependency, and this reduces the chance of conflict. What we will say differently is that why there is a significant interest for China to increase sanctions on Russia and necessarily respond to that way. So CJ's response to this in a POI was, well, Russia has nuclear power, so it's unnecessarily the case that they would do so. Well, that's not true, right? In most cases, there's already been skirmishes in many areas in the past, even when Russia had nuclear power. And the reason why is because, to a large extent, those things are it's unlikely to be a nuclear war in most cases, but still Russia continually gets their energy independence and economic independence eroded. Why will China retaliate? There are 4 reasons. The first is, all these things are easily identifiable. That is, once you remove Huawei from 5G contracts, it's an immediate signal that, well, look, clearly China doesn't do business with Russia. But like, the second reason is, even if you can do it gradually, the CCP relies on knowing that Russia is dependent to ensure that it feels safe on border security. Xinjiang, Tibet, etc. borders a lot of North Asia, North Europe, etc. And therefore, the historical context is very important, right? Like what I told you just now. When Nixon came to engage with relations with China, that led to the fall of the Sino-Russian relationship. Similarly, after the fall of the Soviet Union, necessarily there was also more border skirmishes between Russia and China. There's always been a sense of insecurity in that front, and that's why that dependency is important. Yeah.
We are not ceasing trade with China, we are decreasing dependence. Retaliation hurts less when the economy is less dependent, and CG double knives us when they say the alternative is the West and not Central Asia, which is the opposite of what we brought.
No. Well, which is exactly why I'm telling you, when you do this, you can't just reduce trade, it will necessarily mean you get no trade. That's why you missed the comparative on your side. You have proven why China wouldn't retaliate in this way. But secondly, if China has no great interest in Russia anymore, they can do without Russia. And it's a huge big dick energy to remove one great power which people say are right now competing with China and the US. But lastly, I think this will be seen as Russia shifting from China to the US. And I think CG sort of helps this case, right? Because if indeed it's the case that Russia sides with the US, then even more of a reason for China to retaliate for obvious reasons. Why is this very harmful? So they tell you that 5G security is a problem. Well, no, the UK also employed Huawei as 5G. There are already significant interests you can protect in the development of 5G infrastructure. But China can do far worse. They can exert influence in Central Asian countries through the Shanghai Cooperation and reduce not only Russia's economic influence, but cultural influence. That's bad for the people in Kremlin because they derive a lot of their influence from having the greater Russia influence across Central Asia and Ukraine. But furthermore, right, when you talk about these areas, you're talking about soft power, economic power that Russia loses. The oil pipelines from Central Asia to Russia is funded by the Chinese through the Belt Road Initiative. They lose out on so many other policies as a result of this. Therefore, the biggest thing you have to note here is that China won't be static in the way in which it engages with China. And that reduction, or rather exaggeration of influence, is bad for Russia. Thank you very much.
I consent to being filmed, by the way.
Okay. Thank the member of opposition. We're very happy to call upon the government whip.
Not with a bang, but with a whimper. That's how the opening halves are leaving this competition. Because for all the depth of the analysis they have done, they have misplaced that analysis. Francesca has given the best speech I have ever seen her give, and I am incredibly honored to have been her partner for this competition. So I don't think there's very much work left for me to do, but I'm just going to try and clean up this debate a little bit. So let's start with the accusation that comes from opening government that this is a knife. Well, it's not, because they said you can get Central Asia. We are saying that you can get Central Asia and the West at the same time. You can get your benefits from Central Asia while also getting the West to stop putting sanctions on you and thereby get all the benefits of the West turning towards you and giving you those benefits. But notice something really important. They don't explain to you how they get influence in Central Asia. But we tell you that the main way that you get influence in places like Central Asia and in Africa is at the point at which the West lifts sanctions on you so you can actually trade with those countries more efficiently, but also B, where the West is willing to do things like give you aid, give you funding, give you technology, give you companies into Russia at the point at which you increase your ability to actually fight back against China because your economy is so much better off at the point at which the West is no longer trying to actively fight back against you. The fact that opening government is too short-sighted to see that we can get both is not something that we should be penalized on. That said, let's be very clear on what our case is in this round, okay? I'm going to walk you through and to show you why we get our benefits. The first is that the West, and especially the US, would never accept an alliance with a Russia which is dependent on and subservient to China. This is simply because at the point at which you try and open up to Russia or even ally with Russia, but China controls, for example, your media, China controls access to your security services, China controls access to your deepest military secrets. That's the point at which the West becomes vulnerable if it tried to ally with Russia before Russia had weaned itself off that Chinese dependence. That's why you must first wean yourself off that Chinese dependence before you make that turn towards the West. Notice as well that the US is looking for a powerful partner in the form of Russia. We do get a response from closing where they go, but they have Tokyo and Seoul as well. But I think that's broadly different because A, Tokyo and Seoul simply don't have the same level of military power that Russia has, which is necessary to combat the military strength of China in the region. But second of all, notice that Russia has a lot of presence in other states as well, like Central Asia and Africa, which was considered in this debate, and that's the kind of influence that Russia has can compete with in China in those regions that Tokyo and Seoul simply don't have. So there's no comparative alternative to Russia as a partner. Thirdly, we explained that we gave you lots of reasons why the US would be willing to work with Russia. We gave you reasons, for example, how it often works with states which are ideologically opposed to it, like Saudi Arabia. We gave you explanations, for example, how the US does not mind working with states that have committed human rights abuses. For example, the US is really close with Israel. We all know what Israel is doing in Palestine. But notice, last of all, that at the point at which Russia is pivoting away from its attempt to control Europe and pivoting towards an attempt to control Asia, that's the point at which incentives are no longer diametrically opposed to the incentives of the West, and because they are no longer diametrically opposed, that's when the West feels less threatened, it's likely to take Russia as a partner in Europe. Why are we accepting US influence over us instead of Chinese influence over us? Probably lots of reasons. A, sanctions from US hurt you so much more than anything China can do to retaliate against you, although I will be weighing that in a little bit. Because it means things like, for example, you can get all kinds of foreign investment into a country. I would suggest to you that foreign investment from places like Europe and US combined probably outweigh investment from China. But it's often investment of a much better kind because Chinese investment is targeted and interfering with your state. I think it was incredibly glib for them to say that China has no interest to interfere with the interests of other states. No, China interferes with the governments of states all the time. Things like trying to install its own puppets into those governments. Things like trying to get Chinese-backed people into that government. Because of that, we think that it's much better for the Kremlin if it wants better economic growth and better security over its own government to continue to pick the US over China. How does this weigh against the Chinese retaliation point? Notice something really important, right? The Chinese retaliation point would be a real point in this debate if and only if Russia had no way to fight back against it. But at the point when Russia has the West as an ally willing to back it up against retaliation, that's the point it can do things like fight back over Chinese attempts at control over those Central Asian states that opening government and opening opposition care so much about. So I think that's why we weigh against the Chinese retaliation point. But lastly, weighing against closing, because closing say, why won't the US just take the opportunity to crush Russia right here and now? The answer to this is because if Russia gets crushed right here and now, there is a power vacuum. And given that the power vacuum is in regions where China has much more power than the West, such as Central Asia and Africa, that's the point at which when you crush Russia, that power vacuum is likely to be filled by your greatest ally, i.e. China. That's why you can't just crush Russia now, because the power vacuum is something that you will not be able to take control over. China takes huge control over that power vacuum at the point at which you have crushed Russia. Okay, I'll take opening, yes.
The war in Crimea, the NATO on Russian borders show to you that this conflict is ongoing. But if, in the best case scenario, you want negotiations with the European Union, I provided analysis telling you why strongest hand is on the side of opposition.
Okay, I'm really confused by this because let's be very clear, right? Either you're under China's influence or you're under the EU's influence. We explain why the EU's influence is preferable because the EU doesn't go do things like enter your state and try and topple your government from within. And also because I think that's broadly true. And I think the second thing is, let's face it, the EU is probably fine with letting things like Crimea go, given that we really haven't done very much about it so far. And given that, as we explained earlier, we are often okay with backing states as proxies which just haven't done very good things in the world. So how does this weigh against the other teams in this debate? I think it beats opening government. I think it beats opening government because the alternative world that we give you has so much more than just moving to Central Asian states. It has a world in which you no longer have to worry about sanctions. It is a world where you can diversify away from oil because you finally have a chance to trade on other industries with other states. I think this is your path towards the future. I think it is better than opening government because it avoids all their problems. Because regardless of whether you do this policy or not, the end game for China is control over Russia because Chinese want control. It can either do so now by that retaliation that they care so much about, or they can do so in the long run by slowly strangling out Russia. Given that Russia is always going to lose out to China in the long run, the question is which side gives them the tools to stop them. And we tell you it is the EU. And we tell you that it is the West. That give them the tools, give them the technology, give them the funding, give them a way to stop their stranglehold. And notice it also means that we get all of opening government's benefits with none of opening opposition's harms. And I think this is a huge contribution you should weigh for us in this debate. The last thing that we want to talk about is opening opposition. I think the reason why we take opposing opposition out of this debate, because if you really look at your notes, all of their harms are contingent on Russia not having alternatives. I'm not going to enumerate them because they went for quantity over quality, which I think is always a mistake in debates. But if you look at that, most of the harms, such as, for example, how China is the only source of investment, don't fly at the point at which Russia has alternatives in the form of, for example, US investment. If you look carefully at your notes, right, all that case is contingent on that. Given we prove that Russia does have an alternative in the form of the West, I think that whole case is out. That's why I think we have won this debate.
Thank you, Governor Whip. To conclude the round, we're very happy to call upon the opposition with.
We good? Panel, when the dragon bear sees the bear abandon the dragon tortures it alive. And that's what we showed in closing opposition. That when you leave an angry dragon, the only thing they'll do is spit fire at you. And that's why we won this debate. Because that lackadaisical response from that previous speaker did not explain why it is that Russia wouldn't retaliate, China wouldn't retaliate. And crucially, opening government themselves give us this reason. Because if it is the case that expansionism is the most important consideration for China, then when Russia competes against China for expansionism, you get retaliation. I thank for that opening government team for it. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about opening government, the team of terminal unanswered contingencies, and then I'm going to talk about closing government, the team of utter historical ignorance. Let's look firstly at opening government. I think our extension comprehensively beats them. They have two claims. Firstly, there are antithetical regional interests, and two, there are Chinese perverse incentives, and they kick in. Firstly, on antithetical interests. The first thing that they show is that these antithetical interests necessarily exist. Because there is a very flippant remark from Darren, which is, well, if they have an oil field and you guys are competing for the oil field, then only one of you will come out on top. Hint, there are more than one oil field in Africa. The reason that is important is our extension. At the moment, when there is dependence that Russia has on China and China has on Russia, they trust through the separation of territory that Russia can have its own set of oil fields and China can have its own set of oil fields because the money that goes towards Russia no longer comes at the expense of China as opening government would have it. The manifestation of this is simple. For example, at the moment, Russia actively drills in places like Venezuela and the DRC, whereas China now has its division throughout the east of Africa in places like Djibouti. They had to show, therefore, on a first premise level, why this conflict actually existed in the first place, and that plausibility test did not pass. The second thing that we show is that even insofar as there is competition, we think that it's better that we do not antagonize the Chinese state for the reason that we will get some of the gains that come from that competition even if China does not, in fact, if China prevails, for the reason that if China beats us out, which they don't tell us why Russia would beat China, then it is better that China is buying resources from us so that, for example, if China is the only actor in Angola, we at least get some of the money streaming from Angola. The second thing is, where competition exists, this opening government team had to demonstrate that Russia would supersede China in that competition, and they never did. There were two reasons why they didn't. Firstly, prima facie, China has a bigger economy than Russia and a greater number of state-owned enterprises. They don't prove that they have the capacity to do so. But secondly, this is really important, and this is where their own mechanism collapses on themselves. When China has less money, China has less manufacturing capacity because they're no longer buying Russian goods anymore, Russia can strangle China. Here's the important thing. If Russia doesn't sell its shit to China, Russia also has less money, according to opening government's own metric, which means they too have less capacity, which means they cannot drill in fucking Africa. And that's why they're out of this debate. But thirdly, and this is really important, they had to demonstrate that this offset the losses from Chinese trade, which at no point you are given a mechanism to weigh. I would suggest it is unlikely for the reason that secondary sanctions that the US have implemented mean that thousands of people are unwilling to trade with Russia, but also that China is quite a large market and that is important. The reason this is important, this is very, very important. Money is crucial to the Russian state because it goes towards things like its security apparatus, it funds its foreign priorities and expansion, it allows it to have political stability. These were the three metrics that opening government set out at the beginning of the debate, and they have not won any of them, and that's why we win against opening government. And our extension does that because we show China's far more likely to retaliate, which means the Kremlin's capacity to do all of those things is limited, and there's no implicit material, trust me, I tracked that case, that would allow us them to win. Let's look at closing government, the team of historical ignorance. The only reason they say why the US doesn't stay and actually engage in a coalition with Russia is China. And they had a huge burden here, which is to show that the moment that that Russia no longer associates with it, the US would get involved. You know, that US that is a part of NATO, that US that currently funds rebels against the Ukrainian rebels in Crimea, that Russia that at the moment is hacking its elections, that Russia at the moment which is under huge economic pressure, and therefore we can pretty easily defeat if we're the United States. But they didn't demonstrate at any point that this would be the tipping point, and they asserted that is the case. The one thing they say is the United States would not want to crush Russia because a power vacuum would be then filled by the US. We didn't say that they would necessarily crush Russia as in the Kremlin, but we said they were more likely to make the Kremlin weak. They were more likely to starve it of money. And if you believe that that is the case, given all of the conflicting interests that Russia has, it is far more easy for the US to give them no alternative rather than trade with them and fund a bunch of interests that are antithetical to them, given opening government's framing. That is the most important thing we ought to consider in the debate. The last thing they say is the European Union is good. Again, they didn't prove that this is the case. Before I demonstrate why even if we can see the entirety of closing government's case, why there are, I'll take opening government.
You say China will retaliate and hurt our economy. We said China can and will hurt our economy anyway. Less dependence means less ability to hurt us. This rebuttal is at best disingenuous mitigation without a word of comparative.
No, the reason they will not hurt us is because we tell you at Razak there are a number of outlets at which Russia is reliant. Also, you can't give binary responses, right? It's the scale of harm that China would inflict upon you. They show that there's the possibility that China might do something that will hurt Russia. We give you a guarantee that China will hurt Russia, and that's what you have to weigh in this debate. They say the EU is good because they're not going to rig the cables. I would forward that the CIA will probably also rig your cables, but that's just my feeling. But beyond that, we think that there are other sources of oil that the EU can get, given its expansion in Africa. And also, Russia hacks their elections, they're probably not going to trade with them. But even if they do, why is dependence on the US and the West horrific? Because the reason's simple. There are conflicting interests. It means now every time we buy stuff from the US, our revenues depend on them. The US at any point, given opening government's analysis themselves, are going to be like, fuck you, stop funding this shit. The reason that's more likely to happen on government side is because there are more interests that conflict with the US than China. So at any point they can leverage that and use it against the Kremlin. We do not want to be in that category of dependency if we buy opening government's harms. That's why the comparative is far, far worse. At the end of this debate, we do not want the bear to be torched by the dragon. That's why we're very proud to stand in closing opposition.
Can we have one more round of applause to all speakers?